In this project, we try to answer a question which is certainly not new, but we believe very important, which is how to measure well-being changes. By well-being, I mean satisfaction. And I will argue that while life satisfaction levels are very good at capturing well-being stocks, we could improve the way we measure well-being flows, so changes in satisfaction. Now, why is this important? Well, there are many situations, in particular if you think about policies and interventions, where we want to know the changes in people's feeling, in people's satisfaction. So typically, what we do is that we interview people before the intervention, measuring a life satisfaction level, and after the intervention, and we use this to calculate a delta, the difference between the two. Now, there are two issues with this approach. So one is very pragmatic. In many cases, we don't have panel data. There are some great panel data sets at the national level, but in most situations, we have available only cross-sections, and it would be great to be able to measure changes from cross-sections. The second issue is more subtle, and is the fact that delta life satisfaction is actually not a very sensitive measure. Let me elaborate on this. So both Casper and I, in different papers, noticed that among the people who report no change in life satisfaction, who report the same level over time, about 1/3 say actually that they are better off or worse off than last year. And when we run a regression, when we're trying to explain deltas in life satisfaction, so we're trying to explain the changes, we can explain less than 1% of these variations, and we find this also in other data sets, so not only in the UK. Now, this doesn't come so much of a surprise when you think of this about the sensitivity of the measuring stick, which is the life satisfaction scale. So think of the following: to rise by 1 point on a 0 to 10 life satisfaction scale, we would need an intervention which is equivalent to multiplying income by an order of magnitude. So you take this from a standard income to life satisfaction coefficient of 0.4. So if you double income, you're going to rise life satisfaction on average about 0.4. Then you have to double it again and then add even on it. So very few interventions can hope to have this effect. Now, is it a problem? Well, it's a very conservative approach. It means that when we detect a change in satisfaction, it's definitely there, but we might be failing to detect some situations where actually there is an effect of an intervention, but we just don't capture it. So the question we try to answer is, can we do better? And the idea is far from new. What if, instead of inferring about changes, we ask about changes? So by this I mean measuring subjective changes. Are questions such as, compared to last year, to last month, how satisfied with your life are you nowadays? In theory, there are very good reasons for this question to be measured. And I can mention two. We know from psychophysics that people are more sensitive to changes than to level. We know this from prospect theory as well. There are also studies in industrial organizations showing that this type of measure capture and predict better other variables. However, in practice, we do not really have a systematic comparison of how subjective changes compare to delta levels. In this study, we run actually 3 studies in this paper to test empirically how subjective changes compare to the standard delta levels. So the first study is based on a panel survey that you're all familiar with, which is the British Household Panel Survey that interviewed thousands of people between 1991 and 2009, asking about life satisfaction levels on a scale 1 to 7, as you probably all know. But less people might know that it also asked about subjective changes. So it asked the following question, the one displayed on the screen. Would you say that you are more satisfied with life, less satisfied, or feel about the same as you did 1 year ago? So if we take these two questions, we can construct essentially three proxies for a change in satisfaction. First one is, well, we take the difference between the two life satisfaction levels, so a variable going from -7 to +7, or we can only focus on the ordinal component, so did people report a higher or a lower life satisfaction? So this is a kind of a collapsed variable which is more readily comparable to this variable on satisfaction changes, which tells us if people feel better off or worse off. What we want to know is how well each of these three measures correlates with what's going on in people's life. And to do so, we regress each of them on a set of observable events from the HPS, so 15 events, getting married, losing a job, finding a job, and so forth and so on. And we look at the R-squared, at a measure of how well we're able to explain these proxies. So if we run the regression using the delta levels, so this variable from -7 to +7, as you can see, so this bar chart shows the level of R-squared. So it's a bit below 1%. We already knew this. We know that we're not very good at explaining variations in delta levels. What does happen if we focus only on the direction of the change? Nothing. It's essentially the same. What does happen if we try to explain subjective changes? So R-squared essentially increase by a factor of an order of magnitude. So what does this mean is that we're much better at explaining subjective changes than delta levels, or said differently, that subjective changes correlate much better with life events than delta levels do. Now, we were encouraged by these results, but there are some shortcomings, which are, here we only have a measure of which is ordinal. Do people feel better or worse? And we would like to know, it would be good to distinguish people feel a bit better or much better. What we did is that we collected panel data on prolific from UK residents. So we ran our own two studies. And the main difference between these two studies is that in one study, we interviewed the same people 1 year apart. In the second study, or actually study 3, we re-interviewed the same people 3 months apart. Now, there are good arguments for looking at 1 year apart, which is typically, the lag in the surveys, and there are also more events happening in people's life, but we might be failing to get short-term effects, and also there is more attrition if you look at 1 year. So in both these studies, we ask about life satisfaction levels, so different wording than in the HPS, but the same scale. So standard wordings, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? And then we ask the question about subjective changes compared to 12 months ago or 3 months ago. How satisfied with your life are you nowadays? And we allow the respondents to use a scale from much less satisfied, -3, to much more satisfied, +3. So again, a 7-item scale. And then we asked people about a bunch of objective life events that could have happened in their life. Income rises, income cuts, health diagnosis, honestly, anything you can think of. We recorded 30 events in the hope of trying to rise as much as possible the R-squared in the exercise. On top of life satisfaction, we were interested in looking at satisfaction with life domains. So we asked the same questions about levels and subjective changes for job satisfaction, income satisfaction, health satisfaction, accommodation satisfaction, satisfaction with partnership or being single. We spelled out our hypothesis in a register report, the analysis that we would run, and then we collected the data. Something I'm keen on underlining before I show you the results is that we always ask about events after the satisfaction items to reduce the contamination of one with the other. What do we find? Very similar to the HPS in the sense qualitative. So on the left bar shows you the R-squared in a regression where we're trying to explain delta levels, and we rise R-squared up to 3%, but we're still much better at explaining subjective changes. And this is true both when we interview people at 1 year distance or 3 months distance. Now let me underline that this is a fair comparison. Actually, there is kind of less bit of information in subjective changes. Subjective changes is based on one question. Delta levels is based on 2 questions, it's based on a panel. So this is a pretty fair comparison of the two. And when we look at the difference, well, the R-squared are 4 to 5 times higher in, when we use subjective changes in life. What happens with domain satisfaction? So here you have many bar charts, but the structure is the same of the previous ones that I showed you. And the higher line, the higher panel, the top panel, shows you the results for people interviewed at 1 year distance, and essentially you see that the right-hand side bar is always higher than the left-hand side bar. So subjective changes in all life domains that we look at have higher R-squared and delta levels. When we go on the 3 month distance, the picture is a bit different, because only in the domain of health and income subjective changes outperform. In the other ones we don't really see much difference. But we can safely say that in all these domains subjective changes correlate at least as well as delta levels. Now, before I actually move to this, so this, here I'm showing you only the R-squared. So I could show you 12 regression tables with 30 coefficients each, but I'm not going to do it. So what I can tell you is the sign of the coefficient tends to be consistent between the two, and in particular we do not observe some strange flips, some things which are clearly negative for which we find a positive coefficient. But what is happening, to show you a bit what is happening, let me focus on one variable. Very boringly, as an economist, I'm going to focus on income. And what you see is, when we look at a particular domain satisfaction, which is income satisfaction, so a variable for which essentially income changes is what should predict changes in income satisfaction, what we see is that there is a positive relationship in the change in income satisfaction levels with respect to changes in income levels. So people who report a higher satisfaction with their income tend to have an income rise, and vice versa, people who tend to report a lower satisfaction. Actually, it's zero, but yeah, anyway. For the bottom panel, what you see is, again, that there is this positive relationship between the subjective changes and the change in income, but it's a steeper relationship. So, said differently, people who say that they're better off financially, on average, have an income rise which is higher with respect to people who report a higher level. Now, all this is about validity. So it's about, there is not a golden standard to say, are we actually capturing changes in the feeling of satisfaction? There is not a golden standard for this. What we can do is to look if the measures are correlating with what we would expect it to correlate with, so typically life events. But for a measure to be good, it's not we can't only rely on validity, on the fact of correlating well. For instance, it should also not correlate well with some stuff that we do not want it to correlate well. So, typical example, what's going on in the day. So, we know that what just happened on how the day is going to affect how people report their satisfaction with life, but we want to be sure that this is not a problem for subjective changes. So in our survey we asked, how would you describe your day? A typical day, a bad day, or a good day? And then we look at the correlation between this answer and the two measures, so delta life satisfaction and subjective changes. And if anything, the correlation with subjective changes is lower. So it's not that if you have a good day, you say, oh yeah, I'm better with life than 3 months ago or 1 year ago. So this is some good news. On top of validity, so this is an exercise of discriminant validity, but on top of validity, we also want this data to be reliable. So typical test of reliability is test-retest reliability. You want, ideally, when you ask a question, you would like the same person to answer the same question, to give the same answer a few minutes later. So there is never a 100% correlation between the two, but we can look at how well these subjective changes perform in terms of test-retest reliability. So this beautiful picture made by Casper shows you the, this is why I can say that it's beautiful, shows you the correlation between a question asked at the beginning of the survey. So at the beginning of the survey we ask, how satisfied are you with your life, 1 to 7? And then at the end of the survey we ask the same question again. We ask, sorry, can you reconsider this question and tell us what do you think? And plot the correlation between the two. And we do the same with subjective changes. Now, ideally, we would have a 45-degree line. This never happens, but we have an 80% correlation, which is an excellent correlation in terms of psychometric reliability. Sorry. The third and last test that I would like to show you, because we actually run 7 tests, but in the interest of time, I'm going to show you only one other test, which is about cognitive reliability. So asking, are you better off than 3 months ago, might be a hard question to answer. People might feel that they're actually not really able to answer this question. So we wanted to see how people feel with respect to this question. And to measure this, we asked people to report the intervals within which they feel sure about their answer. So we did the following. We asked, for instance, how satisfied are you with your life? Scale 1 to 7, let's say you say 4. Then we ask, okay, you said 4, but just choose, you can choose more options, the ones within which you feel sure of your reply. So it could be 4 and 5, or 3, 4 and 5, or 2, 3 and 4 and 5 if you're really not sure. And we asked the same question for subjective changes. Based on these answers, we constructed an interval which essentially measured the subjective uncertainty of the answer given to these questions. And what you can see in the graph is that there are 2 shaded areas, and the blue areas tend to be, if anything, a little bit larger, encompassing the reddish yellowish area. This tells us that the subjective uncertainty about reporting levels is, if anything, a bit higher than about reporting changes. So people seem to feel able to answer this question with a reasonable sense of certainty. This brings me to the conclusions. So what I hope what we hope we found is that subjective changes are more sensitive and as reliable as life satisfaction to capture changes over time. The R-squared are much higher. Now, you might be concerned about the fact that the high R-squared are related to the fact that when asked about, do you feel better, people change, oh, what did happen in my life? Okay, maybe I changed my job, so I should say that I feel better. We cannot exclude this possibility, but it's a similar type of problem that we have with life satisfaction levels. You could be asked, how satisfied are you with your life or with your job? And you might think of what's going on and then answer based on this. So we can't get around this problem, but we don't think it's really a new problem. And what we feel as a recommendation is that subjective changes should always be measured in cross-sections, along with life satisfaction levels, if we want to leverage the most of these thousands of interviews which are run every year. And that's it for me.